Okay, the U.S. Supreme Court plans to take up two cases involving the president's tariff policies. Those tariffs will stay in place after the Federal Court of Appeals ruled President Trump exceeded his authority by imposing them. I'm going to bring in CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson to join me to talk about this. She's also a Loyola law professor. So let's begin with these tariffs. The tariff cases and the legal arguments that are being made, Jessica, break that down for our audience.
So we have to start with the Constitution because the Constitution gives Congress the power to do things like lay and collect taxes and duties and to oversee interstate commerce. Now, the question then is, can Congress give that power away? So next, Vlad, we have to look at statutes, and that's exactly what's happening in this case. We're looking to see if Congress gave its authority to impose tariffs to the president. I think the issue for the president and why he has faced challenges in the lower courts and frankly losses in the lower courts is because he's putting his money, essentially, he's placing his argument on a statute that doesn't use the word tariff and has never been used to impose tariffs. It's something called the IEEPA, and he's making kind of a novel argument that that particular statute gives him emergency power to do a lot of things, including these reciprocal tariffs. So far, as we just mentioned, courts have not been receptive to this argument, but it really will be, in the first instance, a matter of all the justices looking at that statute and trying to figure out, did Congress want to give the occupant of the Oval Office the power to do what President Trump is trying to do here?
So we've seen, as you know, Jessica, several rulings by the court that allow Trump's policies to move forward while undergoing the legal process. Just this week, we saw that in immigration enforcement, personnel cases, and even in funding cuts. What does this mean as to how the court will? I'm not asking you to predict how they're going to rule, but what does it mean just in general that these cases are still ongoing and the court is then meant to do something once it actually hits the docket?
Okay, I love this question because it allows us to highlight the fact that it didn't used to be this way. There are a lot of these so-called emergency docket, or Justice Barrett in her interview with Norah O'Donnell said interim docket or shadow docket decisions. What do we mean by that? Exactly, Vlad, as you just laid out, which is that generally speaking, what will happen is there's some executive order or executive action. It's challenged in the courts below. Sometimes President Trump loses, and then he goes to the Supreme Court and says, stay that lower court decision where I lost, pause that. And he's asking the court, again, for that emergency relief to push pause. A lot of times he is getting that relief. Now, you said I'm not going to ask you to predict, but what does this mean? So this is not a final ruling on the merits from the Supreme Court. It's a decision about whether or not to pause a lower court decision. But in their decision about whether or not to push pause, they're looking at who's likely to succeed on the merits, on the ultimate question. So it tells us a little bit about the court's thinking, but they're not answering the ultimate questions here.
All right, before I let you go, because you brought up that interview that Norah O'Donnell did with Justice Amy Coney Barrett, I'm curious, in one of her answers, when Norah asked about the lean of justices, whether they are right-leaning or left-leaning or conservative or liberal, she indicated that that isn't the case, that they just decide the law, which is what you would expect an associate justice to say. But I'm curious, I mean, this whole concept of a conservative court, a liberal court, a right-leaning judge, a left-leaning, we've had that discussion since the founding of the Republic. So what did you make of that response? And are citizens to believe a Supreme Court justice when they say that they're not right or left, they're just right down the middle interpreting the Constitution?
So I watched the full extended interview, and I did hear that part. I think part of what she's doing, as you said, a Supreme Court justice is never going to say, I'm biased. But part of what I heard her trying to highlight is that she might have a specific legal worldview. She might have a specific ideology, and she was very explicit about that. She said, I'm an originalist. I'm a textualist. When I approach these questions, this is my paradigm. This is my analytical framework for approaching it. And that, we have to be honest, is different from more liberal justices who look at these questions in a different lens and might see the Constitution as a living, breathing document. But I think what she's, back to what we were talking about, I think she's trying to contrast this is my legal philosophy is different from I am a partisan politician, is different from I am just a conservative politically. I think she was making a big effort to highlight the difference between legal thought and outcomes that might benefit one party. What are people to take of that? Obviously, people are going to have very different opinions. One thing I would just highlight is a lot of the court's decisions actually are unanimous, just not the ones you and I talk about, Vlad.
Right. All right. So, and when we say originalist, Jessica, that would mean that if something has, for example, the 3/5 compromise, just to take something that's, in 1868, the 14th Amendment comes along, and we don't have that compromise anymore. We're not talking about going back to the very first draft of the Constitution, right?
Okay, thank you. So what she's doing is saying, I'm looking at the current Constitution as it is written, not the original Constitution, not before the Reconstruction Amendments, not before the Bill of Rights. And she's saying it's an interpretive tool. I'm trying to figure out what the terms and words of our current Constitution meant when they were written.
Got it. Really always great to have you, Jessica. I always enjoy our conversation so much. They're always wrapping me, even though I want to keep going. Thank you very much, as always, my friend. Appreciate it.